Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this joint CGSR and Data Science Institute talk. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome our esteemed guest speaker today. Dr. Lisa Garcia Bedolla is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and the director of the Institute for Governmental Studies. The IGS promotes research, educational activities, and public service in the areas of American and California politics and broad domains of public policy. More recently, IGS has extended their intellectual reach to include the study of defense and national security policy, a topic of great interest for our Center for Global Security Research here at LLNL. That serves to bridge science and technology with national security policy. Dr. Bedolla uses tools of social sciences to reveal the causes of political and economic inequalities in the United States, considering differences across the lines of ethno-race, gender, class, geography, sexuality, etc. She studies why people choose to engage politically and has a wide variety of social science methods, participation, observation, in-depth interviewing, survey research, field experiments, and GIS systems to shed light on this particular question. She has published 4 books and dozens of research articles, earning 5 National Book Awards and numerous other awards. She is one of our nation's foremost experts in political engagement within communities of color. And she has been recently featured on several of my favorite morning radio shows, including KQED's California Report and KQED's Forum. She appears as an expert panelist and commentator on these shows. Her current projects include an analysis of how technology can facilitate voter mobilization among voters of color in California, and a historical exploration of race, gender, and class inequality at the heart of the founding of California's public school system. Professor Bedolla earned her PhD in political science from Yale and her BA in Latin American Studies and Comparative Literature from UC Berkeley. Today, she brings us a message about the tremendous opportunities and potentials of big data, as well as a warning about the hidden dangers associated with our newfound data collection and analysis capabilities. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Lisa Garcia Bedolla.
Thank you for that very generous and long introduction. And thank you all for being here in the middle of the afternoon when I'm sure you have lots of things to do. And I was saying that this is both an honor and a privilege for me to be here, but it's also very well timed because otherwise I would be obsessively checking the Secretary of State's website about all of the races that still haven't been decided this morning. So you're giving me something else to focus on, which is much more productive. So I just want to talk about, I'm going to talk about these issues from the position of what I know best, which is statistical social science research, but I think a number of the issues I'm going to raise, I think, cut across a lot of different disciplinary areas, and I'm going to talk for a little bit, and I'm hoping to have the opportunity to have, ideally, a good conversation about where we go with these questions. So I'm going to start with a picture. I don't know how many of you have seen this picture. It's a photo of a grave of a Viking warrior that was discovered in the 1880s. And you'll see the skeleton and the artifacts around it. So because it was a very large skeleton, and because the skeleton was buried, you'll see there were 2 horses buried alongside, a number of weapons with them, and a strategy game very similar to chess, which relates to war. It was decided at the time when the grave was discovered that this was a warrior, right? And that it was an example of how warriors were honored in Viking culture. And much of kind of our understandings and framings of the Vikings came out of this discovery in the 1880s. The one question that was never asked was the gender of the skeleton. And about just a couple years ago, a researcher said, that pelvis actually looks feminine. And in fact, they found out that this was a woman. And I use it as an example of saying, often we look at something and in fact don't ask questions about things that are pretty basic to the thing that we're seeing, but because we're so socialized to see the world and imagine the world in a particular kind of way, the question doesn't get asked. And so to just as researchers, as people that deal in empirics, to really think about what are all the things that you're not asking questions about because you just think it's normal or it's just the way it is, and how do we create systems in our practice that force us to actually ask those questions. And I think it's not easy because humans, we tend to just categorize things very quickly, but that's what I want to talk to you about today, is really thinking deeply about what is it we don't know because we've just actually never asked the question. So at least thinking about social science, it's also important to really think about where our tools came from. And at least in the social sciences, the field of statistics was developed by eugenicists to explain the differences across human populations that they thought were kind of part of the natural order of things. And so I think it's critical to imagine that their worldview is embedded in how they created the tools themselves, right? And I think, I know I took my stats classes in graduate school and learned about Pearson, and and many people actually don't even learn that these are people. You just know that this is the thing this is the code that you run in Stata or in whatever R or whatever program you use in order to get the thing, because that's how everybody does it. But often we don't take that step back and talk about the theory and the assumptions about the social world, or the assumption about relationships across the variables that you're studying that in fact are embedded in the math that these folks developed in order to create these tools. And so thinking about those biases, and I think especially, again, speaking from the social sciences, our students spend a tremendous amount of time now learning to code in Python, learning to code in R, learning about all these different statistical techniques, but it's rare that you have the course before the course of thinking about, well, where do these tools come from? Who developed them? What, in fact, are they assuming about the relationship across the variables that you're talking about? Or on a basic level, if we think about standard regression, right, you're assuming that all of your variables are independent of one another, right? We talk about this as the billiard ball effect. You assume every single variable has an independent impact on the dependent variable. But in fact, we know, for example, if we think about race and class or race and gender, that those things are intertwined and that they're related. And so where you sit class-wise is actually directly related to and interdependent with your class status or your gender status. And so we know things about how the world works that in fact the tools don't reflect. And so just thinking about that prior, I think, is really important. And especially as we imagine biases in data collection and interpretation, right? So first, where does the data come from? And this is something that I think in this moment is especially important. Historically you had, again, in the social sciences, you had survey research that tended to be collected by survey houses or research firms in a very particular kind of way. Now you have Google surveys, right, that a lot of scholars are using because you can very inexpensively ask one question and magically, 500,000 people might show up in your, answering your one question. I personally don't answer those Google surveys. I don't know how many other people, that little pop-up box that says, would you like to take, right? Or, depending on the browser that you use. And so we have no information about the biases that exist in sort of who are the kind of people that answer those surveys. Do they answer them honestly? Because then there's the other question, if you're thinking about surveys, of translation. Right? So we take something in English, we translate it into another language. And I say I'm guilty of this. I've done this a million times in the course of my career. But if we think about, right, not only are you assuming that everybody in English actually interprets the answer to the question the way that you think you understand it, but then you're switching it into other languages and asking people. I think the best example, at least in politics, we ask people about liberal versus conservative, right? Well, what does that mean? If you've just migrated here from a country that has a very different political structure, you don't know where you sit on this continuum, right, that's very much US-based. And so just thinking about where information comes from, what might be missing. So there is a wealth of administrative data, as I'm sure since all of you work for the US government, you know that exists across all of the different agencies, bureaucracies, paperwork, yeah. We'll call it administrative data, yeah. All those lovely things that actually probably many people in this room help to produce. But often we don't think about how it's produced, what's possibly missing, who might be the people who are either underreported or overreported. Are there systematic gaps in particular parts of the country among particular kinds of people? Again, I think there's a tendency when you have a data set that exists, that it becomes real, right, in a very meaningful way for people, without sort of thinking about what those numbers represent and what are the human beings, or who are the human beings that sit behind all those numbers. And then it's a matter of interpretation, which I think we often, people who are dedicated to empiricism try to talk about how, pre-registering your data, having a pre-analysis plan, that there's objectivity, right? That the researcher can, through methodology, actually remove themselves from the research. And I would argue that that's never possible. In fact, because we all come to the world with a particular worldview, with a particular lens. We all may have seen that grave as a man, just because that's who we are. So our interpretation is biased from the beginning because there's a realm of possibility that we don't even imagine, right, because of where we come from. And so in particular, if you think about the study of race, again, thinking about in the social sciences, when you make race into a dummy variable in a regression, what you're essentially doing, and almost always, at least in the social sciences, we use white men as the excluded category, right? So by definition, what you're actually doing when you talk about women or when you talk about people of color is you're measuring the degree of deviation from the norm of white men. Why do we do it that way? Right? That's just the way we do it, but why do we do it that way? And so the norm never actually gets questioned or studied or thought about, right? Everyone's just a deviation from what we should be, right? And where you should be. So that's just something to think about, because then if you say, and this happens a lot, if you think about labor statistics, if you think about other kinds of statistics, when people say, African Americans do X, or Latinos do Y, or how much last night people were talking about the black vote or the Latino vote or this. On some level, you're falling into almost a biological essentialism to say that because you're in this descriptive category, you are going to behave in X manner, or because you're in this descriptive category, you have these kinds of economic opportunities, rather than talking about the structures that actually have led to people, perhaps if Latinos behave in a similar way in politics, it's actually because they're socialized into the political world in a particular kind of way. It's not because they actually have this descriptive characterization. Does that make sense? I see a furrowed brow. That always makes me nervous.
I'm a statistician, so just ignore my face. I'm trying to understand what sort of assumptions you've been making, I guess, in order to reach those.
I'm saying if you're interpreting a dummy variable as reflecting the characteristics of an entire population, right, an descriptive category of entire population, to just think about making kind of blanket claims about an entire population is in some ways homogenizing that population and you're assuming that
there's an actual, that everything is occurring at a point as opposed to being distributed over many different possibilities.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That was actually what I was reaching my mind. I was like, oh, they're just trying to make one summary point.
Right.
As opposed to considering all possibilities, which is convenient.
And easy.
It's not what professionals would do.
Well, it's actually what professionals do a lot. Okay, not you, but others. But just, I think the broader point is that interpretation is actually is more art than science, right? And that people put a lot onto the data that sometimes isn't in the data because of the assumptions that they brought to the work in the first place. And that the key point is thinking more about what is your epistemology? Like, where does knowledge come from in how you think about your work, right? What is the role of the researcher? What is your role, right, as an actor in whatever research process? in terms of both setting up what the question is, but then also interpreting your answer to it, right? Because by definition, we have a lot of power in how we set up the research question, and that in many ways will drive what kind of answer you do get. And it also precludes often other kinds of answers that perhaps you didn't imagine, if we go back to the Viking, right? And so how to think about a way to set up the research process where you have kind of reflexive moments all the way along so that you're actually thinking about what you're not thinking about, right? Or that you have checks and balances in your team for people to work with one another to really think deeply about what are we assuming here about this particular phenomenon? Are there other possible interpretations? I mean, people call these counterfactuals, but you can call it whatever you want. But at a minimum, creating that culture in your team where you're actually asking those questions at every stage of the process so that you can come out with, ideally, a better sense of the answer, right? Because by definition, we're human. Nothing we're ever going to do is flawless or perfect. But the more, my philosophy is the more you triangulate and the more brain power you bring to the same question, chances are you're going to come out with a better answer. And so I do think the advent of big data really does open up a whole new set of possibilities in this regard. And this is partly, again, coming from, as somebody who wanted to study race in American politics, surveys in general, always underrepresented people of color, right, pretty significantly. And especially if I wanted to study women of color, that was even harder, right, because there were even fewer of those in the data. And so what big data means, right, is that we're actually not even using samples anymore. So now I can use the voter file, and it's everybody, right? So I don't have to worry about the error in the sampling and the error in the analysis and weighting the thing and all the other things that you have to do. And so and you can actually have enough of subcategories that you can really get into the nuance and the granularity of particular populations. And so that is great, right? It's also, we've had this democratization of information. People can access information in ways they couldn't before. Tableau allows people that may not have a lot of quantitative skills to, in fact, do basic analysis of administrative data and other kind of data in a way that wasn't possible even 5 years ago. And you can get at this intersectional question, right? You can really get into, well, what is it like to be, a poor woman in Appalachia versus a poor woman in, Colorado or things like that, which weren't really doable before. The other thing that we also have is this contextualization, right? Because we know that people live their lives in community and in context, thinking about GIS and other kinds to be able to layer data, right, in ways that we couldn't before, of being able to situate people in their lived environment, being able to think about how that lived environment might affect their day-to-day lives, transportation routes, if we think about that, environmental problems, proximity to green space, all kinds of ways to really have a much more rich story of any kinds of questions that you're asking about. And also you can really, I think, ask bigger questions. And so I think this is really a revolutionary moment in terms of thinking about research because we just have so much more information than we used to have. But we still have those biases, right? We are still being trained to not really think beyond that warrior being a man, right? Or to not really necessarily question a lot of the assumptions we have about how the world works and how people work. And this was going to be a place, I was going to show you a video, which some of you may have seen. It's a TED Talk on bias in algorithms. And have people seen this? So it's an African-American woman who, when she was a college student, she was a computer science student, and she had to work on face recognition software. And in order to do her senior project, she literally had to create a white mask and wear it in order for the computer to recognize her face. Because the training data that had been used to create the algorithm didn't have any black faces in it, right? And that may seem kind of silly, but it's really indicative, right, of just if you're in a homogeneous team or if you're in a team of people that just doesn't think about these sorts of things, you're going to create biased results, right? Another example, my husband used to work for Toyota. Their first generation voice recognition software was produced by a very nice couple of brothers in Seattle. I won't say the name of their company since we're being videotaped. It ended up that their voice recognition software couldn't recognize female voices. So I asked them, much to my husband's chagrin when I met them, like, you know, women are 51% of the population. Did y'all think that maybe we want our cars to actually understand what we say? And they said they didn't have any female engineers to do the training data for the. They have wives, they've got sisters, they got friends. I mean, they could have found a girl to do something, but it wasn't seen. They didn't think it was that important, right? And the fact that Toyota didn't think it was that important and put this product in the market, I think speaks a lot to what we're imagining. So we think we have all this technology, and we have these systems and these algorithms that are sort of pretty and elegant and magical because they can do all these things, but they're only as good as what we put into them. It's kind of the garbage in, garbage out principle still holds, no matter how fancy our data gets. And there still are these big blind spots and biases that we all have. I want to make sure, you know, all of us, right, see the world in a very particular kind of way. And I think just appreciating that we have to constantly kind of push back on our own biases, I think in the end will lead us to a place where we actually have face recognition software that can recognize everybody's face. That would be nice, right? I think that's a fair goal for everyone. But I think, how do we set up systems, right, or expectations so that we can actually catch this? And this, I don't claim to have the answer to this, but I think this is the challenge, right, in the current moment, because the danger is when data becomes decontextualized. And this is, I think, with big data especially, a real danger because it's so big and it's so removed from wherever it came from. And the perfect example of this is the Clinton campaign in 2016. How many of you guys heard of Ada? Anybody hear about Ada? Yeah, Ada didn't do any well, which is why she's not famous. Ada was the algorithm, the computer program, that was developed for the Clinton campaign to basically tell her where to go and where she should spend her time and where she should spend her resources. They would put information in, and Ada would tell them where to go. And Ada was the one that said, you don't need to go to Wisconsin. It's good. Wisconsin's good, right? The way that Ada was different than what happened in the Obama campaign was that they didn't actually get information from the field, right? They didn't input what canvassers were saying or whether they were meeting their numbers in Florida, right? Or the kind of on-the-ground, kind of granular information about, you know, how many people were being responsive at the doors, right? How were their IDs of people saying that they're going to vote for Clinton? They weren't putting that in. They were putting in the polling numbers, and they were putting in other numbers. And so what you get out is only as good as what you get in, right? And what they got out was this very sort of, you know, I'm sure they had a lovely power analysis that you have an 80% probability that if you spend 3 hours in Wisconsin, you're going to get this much back. But if you spent those hours in Michigan, you know, I'm sure it was lovely. But the quality of the information and the output wasn't what it could have been because of the assumptions embedded in it. I think last night's issues with polling, again, right, with the election is exactly the same thing. Every poll is based upon a likely voter model. And that's just, you're just making it up, basically, or you're making your best guess. But if the voter universe ends up being very different than what it was in the past, you're not going to be able to make accurate predictions. Or you will, but you're going to have a bit more error, right? I mean, they weren't extremely off. They were off by a bit in a number of places. So I think just thinking about, within the context of your work, where are those places, where are those biases? And how do we think about building in systems to ask those questions before you decide not to go to Wisconsin? So possible solutions, and again, I'm hoping we can talk about this a little bit, and I think it varies across different kinds of work. But I think really questioning every stage of the research production process, from the point of how are we even defining the project or the problem? Why do we think it's a problem, right, versus another problem? Or why are we asking this question instead of that question? Thinking about ontology and epistemology, I know those are horrible words. It'd be lovely if we had better words because they tend to put people off. For people who don't know, ontology is just your genesis story. It's where you think things come from, how you think the world works. Epistemology is where you think knowledge comes from, What is knowledge? What counts as knowledge? So if we go back to the Clinton campaign example, they didn't think that the knowledge on the ground was valuable knowledge. And so that wasn't part of their process in terms of their data analysis. That's an epistemological choice, right, about what matters. What kind of information do you need to get in order to actually make an accurate prediction? And then, where are you in the process? All of you are likely deeply committed to the things that you work on. I tell this to my students too. I wouldn't be standing in front of them talking to them about this stuff if I didn't care passionately about the things that I study, right? So I think we need to own our own. So on the positive side, yes, we're really passionate about these things, but we have ideas about what's good and what's bad, right? We have normative feelings about the purpose of our work and the things that we do. And I think the more we can be self-aware, the better we'll be in the research process. Questioning where the data comes from, so like the training data for the face recognition algorithm, how diverse? Does it reflect the actual diversity of humanity, right? If you want it to recognize all kinds of faces, do you have training data that actually provides you with that? And if not, find some that does. Who's missing? If we're thinking about administrative data, right? Are there certain populations that just aren't, if we think about the next census, you're going to have certain populations that just aren't present or aren't accurately counted. How do you account for that? Think about that as you work through. And then also making sure that how you're interpreting the data matches the theory. And at least in the social sciences, theory's kind of gotten a bit of a bad rap. But I think if we go back to the race assumption, if you think about the assumptions that are made in a standard regression model, they actually don't match how we understand these categories work in the real world, right? These categories are not distinct from one another. They are, in fact, interwoven. And so can we think about, simple things, using random effects instead of fixed effects, back to the statistician, because we know people start at different places in the intercept. That fits the theory. Even if it doesn't substantively affect the outcome, you really want to make sure that how you're modeling or operationalizing your work actually fits what you know about how the world works. Oh, I didn't know that was my last one. Sorry. I depend heavily on presenter tools, and I didn't have these. But I guess just to end, I think this is an opportunity to have a conversation as we change what we have information about and what kind of information we're able to use to really, I think the exciting thing about data science is that it is a deeply interdisciplinary exercise, right? It's a set of tools and a set of orientations that cuts across multiple disciplines and multiple areas. And I think if we're going to take advantage of this data revolution, we actually have to be much more systematic about breaking down those silos, at least coming from the higher education. The engineers need to talk to computer scientists, need to talk to statisticians, need to talk to social scientists, right? And that everyone's orientation, if we're talking across these lines of difference or lines of division, actually then can you have a robust and really good product, right? And so I think I'm hoping that this is an opportunity to be more thoughtful about how teams are constructed and what kinds of, what value different disciplinary orientations can bring in order to actually triangulate all those different kinds of information so that you're getting closer to the truth, even if I'm not sure as humans we can ever truly find the truth, right? But that you're getting closer to, in fact, having that unbiased and really robust outcome. And I will end with that and open it up to your questions.